insurance companies. These tribunals at Tribunals Ontario, it houses 14 tribunals, and some of the ones with key problems are at Tribunals Ontario. As their term ended, the Ford government let expert adjudicators go, and most of them had been appointed by the previous Liberal government. And then the government took well over 2 years to refill these positions. And without, of course, wanting to downgrade the skills that the new adjudicators brought, it's fair to say that they couldn't match the subject matter expertise or the adjudication and mediation expertise that the group that was let go had. There were virtually no mentors left to guide the new appointees. The senior position at Tribunals Ontario was filled by a former Tory election candidate who had lots of experience at a big law firm, but none in managing a justice tribunal or in serving a population of low-income tenants facing eviction or social assistance recipients, marginalized victims of discrimination, disabled motor vehicle accidents victims. That was not in his previous experience. So what does the current crisis look like? I suspect that many people on this call already know from their experience. I'll give you some examples, focusing on 4 tribunals at Tribunals Ontario: the Landlord and Tenant Board, the Human Rights Tribunal, the Social Benefits Tribunal, and the Automobile Accident Benefit Service. So at the Landlord and Tenant Board, the crisis was recognized by the Ombudsman back in 2020. And at that time, landlords were waiting 8 weeks for a hearing and tenants were waiting 7. The Ombudsman started an investigation, largely because small landlords were telling the media that they were losing their life savings when they were unable to evict a non-paying tenant. Those wait times have now increased tenfold. The Ombudsman still hasn't provided a report. The tribunal itself informed landlords last year that they should expect to wait 8 months, no longer 8 weeks, for a hearing, and tenants wait 7 months. 2 other changes introduced at the Landlord and Tenant Board have had a detrimental effect on access to justice. Tribunals Ontario removed in-person hearings as an option in all but very exceptional cases. In fact, we've only heard of 1 in-person hearing in the last couple of years. Tenants with limited internet access have no option but to participate in their hearing by telephone, at a disadvantage to landlords who are able to attend by video conference. These are hearing blocks of 30 to 40 matters, and tenants participating by phone often can't tell whose voice is the adjudicators. Is there a tenant duty counsel on the call? Who's the landlord rep? Both landlords and tenants report chaos in these hearings. The Landlord and Tenant Board is also, under the government's direction, closed its regional offices and regional hearing locations. Adjudicators are no longer familiar with local circumstances, and tenants can't easily access local tenant duty counsel or municipal housing inspectors, municipal rent banks, resources that would help them avoid eviction in the past. At the Social Benefits Tribunal, people on welfare have been waiting up to 2 years for a hearing, and this means they're stuck living on $730 a month. Most of these appeals are successful, but in the meantime, an appellant can lose their housing or their health. The medical evidence may become dated, and it's also difficult to testify, again, over the phone about what your medical condition was 2 years previously. At the Human Rights Tribunal, the backlog has doubled to over 9,000 cases, which translates into a 3 to 4 year backlog for matters going to a hearing. Applicants are waiting months or even a year for the tribunal to take the first required step of delivering their application to the other side, whether that's their employer or a service provider. The tribunal's chosen method of dealing with the backlog has been to restrict its own jurisdiction, and it's dismissing hundreds of cases after a cursory review of the application form. These are cases that in the past would have gone to at least a summer hearing, and often would have proceeded to mediation or been settled before a hearing on the merits, or gone to a full hearing in the merits. For the first time, applicants need a lawyer to ensure that their application is drafted to address all the legal elements to prove discrimination. So the Ford government has in effect turned an accessible process into one that rivals the courts. Over 80% of applicants are unrepresented when they file their application, and the application is designed to allow that. Hundreds of applications with potential merit are now being dismissed by the tribunal at an early stage by the same inexperienced adjudicators on the basis that the applicant will not be able to prove that the negative treatment they experienced was caused by the discriminatory ground. But that is precisely the job of the tribunal, to hold hearings, hear the evidence, and decide if discrimination was even one factor in the negative treatment. I probably don't have time to talk about the automobile accident benefit service backlog, but it has quadrupled to 16,000 over the past several years. And it means that people who are injured in car accidents may not be able to get the physiotherapy they need. I understand that cases are delayed at every stage. So Tribunals Watch Ontario has recommendations. Gary's going to talk about some of the fundamental system changes that we're seeking, but just some specific things that I'll throw on the table now before handing it over to Gary. We need leadership at Tribunals Ontario in particular that recognizes the depth of the access to justice crisis at the four critical tribunals. And we need leadership that's committed to addressing the crisis. We need in-person hearings to become an option, like at the Federal Social Security Tribunal. We need the LTB to restore regional hearings, which has been the case for its 80-year history up until now, the history of landlord and tenant law in Ontario. The Human Rights Tribunal must stop its current practice of initiating its own dismissal motions as a routine matter. And Tribunals Ontario has to open its doors to collaborative problem solving with its constituencies on the basis of a transparent sharing of the data. I'll stop there and I'll hand it over to Gary.
Thanks, Kathy. You know, I've been in the tribunal world for almost 40 years, right? Starting with my first legal clinic job in 1985, and then I've been appointed, reappointed by the Liberals, the MPP, and the PCs. I was also a special advisor at the Immigration and Refugee Board for 10 years. So I've seen lots of transitions between parties and premiers or prime ministers, and how this affects adjudicative tribunals. The sad reality is that elections cause turmoil in tribunals. We don't like to talk about it a lot in the tribunal world, but you know, it's just not right. Tribunals are judicial bodies, and tribunal members have the same powers as judges. We hold hearings, we assess evidence and facts, and then we make binding decisions that affect many individuals and communities. And yet many elected leaders insist on politicizing the appointment and reappointment of tribunal members as if they were like part of the government's operational agencies or advisory boards. And so this means a really important part of our justice system is affected by politics and elections in a way that we would never accept for our courts. And we only need to look south of the border, right, to see how democracy suffers when judicial independence is not respected. I should also be clear here, though, because you know, despite all the problems we see, there are and there have been many dedicated and excellent tribunal staff and adjudicators, including many who don't have political connections. But we have to face the big problems caused by turnover and by politicization. We end up with less quality and less diversity when potential applicants think the selection process is politicized, right, or not merit-based, or when existing members cannot rely on the appointments. A lot of them will leave, or they will not be reappointed. So this means a loss of expertise and often big gaps and long vacancies. As a tribunal chair, I can tell you how this makes it so much harder to lead the organization, to build collegiality and a tribunal culture, and to invest in the people, in the training and the performance of our members. So, you know, this sadly happens at all levels and with all parties. I've been a public servant too long to be partisan. And there might be an exception in Quebec, and also for about 10 years under the McGuinty Liberal government in Ontario, where really, I'm guessing that their long majority perhaps gave them the security and maybe the luxury of a long-term vision to move away from the typical politicized approach to tribunal appointments. But generally, adjudicative tribunals we're too often misunderstood and undervalued. And you know, these last few years, the pattern of politicized tribunal appointments in Ontario at the senior level, it's the worst I have seen. The worst I have seen in my decades in the tribunal world, both federally and provincially. You know, if we look just at Tribunals Ontario, you know, the big mega cluster, right, that we're talking about. Here's a taste of the senior appointments we have from this government: the executive chair and the alternate executive chair, and then the associate chairs appointed to 8 of the 11 tribunals. All of them have connections to the PCs or conservatives. You just have to do an internet search. So this, you know, and to be clear, I'm not saying that, you know, anyone with political ties should be disqualified. You know, that should be a disqualification from being appointed as a judge or a tribunal member, but nor should it be a qualification. And you know, having political connections to the governing party, it just becomes much more problematic when we have the situation we have now, where there is an obvious pattern of politicized appointments. So what do we do about this, right? The long-term challenge, I think, is to build a rock-solid foundation for tribunal independence that withstands political change. We need to fundamentally transform how the public and the government see adjudicative tribunals. We are not like advisory boards or operational agencies. We must apply the law, not government policy. And you know, logically, this leaves no room for any political considerations in appointing or reappointing the adjudicators. Practically, at Tribunal Watch Ontario, we've suggested 2 structural ways to support the adjudicative independence of tribunals. One area is to change the current standing committee on government agencies that reviews intended appointments. This committee has really shown itself to be powerless to select or review the appointees who should face more public scrutiny. You know, it's an all-party review. And they have this 30-day deadline that, you know, when it just automatically runs out, and then the OIC gets approved after the 30 days. It's a farce sometimes. The other major change proposed by Tribunal Watch Ontario is to set up an adjudicative tribunal justice council. This council would be independent, it would be nonpartisan, it would be in an act, right, in a statute, and it would oversee the administration of tribunal appointment processes, especially senior level ones, and other aspects of tribunal justice in Ontario. And, you know, I'll end off here by saying I really don't think it's being like overly dramatic to say that the independent, you know, having independent, fair, and accessible tribunals, that's an essential part of our democracy. So when we politicize our justice institutions, that starts us down the path to people and communities that become disengaged from democracy, or cynical, or polarized, or angry. And I hope we can all work together to put us on a more positive path. Thanks. And I think Gilles is next. Is that right?
Thanks, Gary. Well, I've been dealing with the Landlord and Tenant Board issues in general for a much shorter period than most of the distinguished speakers today. I'm part of a group of a small group that started an organization called ONTA, and we're mostly known for running a Facebook group where users of the tenant rights system in Ontario can network and learn from each other. The group has grown to about 55,000 members over 3, maybe 4 years. And so we're primarily concerned with issues at the Landlord and Tenant Board, to a lesser extent, the Human Rights Tribunal. The members in our Facebook group, Ontario Tenant Rights, have a variety of issues that they come to the group with. Most of the people that arrive for help on Facebook are people that cannot afford legal advice. So they arrive, frankly, quite desperate sometimes, because they don't know where to go after they've received this very confusing notice from their landlord. They think they could be evicted. They don't understand the process. And to be frank, quite a lot of tenants are not aware of the existence of the Landlord and Tenant Board. A shocking amount of tenants. So we try to provide a place where people that have been through the process before teach those that are going through it for the first time, and we try to raise the bar in as much as non-legal advice can raise the bar. We try to connect people with the best advice out there, whether it be lawyer-vetted advice on accredited websites, or connected them with Legal Aid Ontario, or just simply reminding them that at any Landlord and Tenant Board hearing, you're supposed to be able to access tenant duty counsel. I think one of the threads that I'm hearing when other more experienced people than myself are talking, such as Kathy, who said that most people understand the chaos that's happening at the Landlord and Tenant Board. I don't get that feeling, frankly. I don't think there's enough understanding of the ramifications of this chaos on ordinary people, because I see it every day when somebody arrives desperate for help. I think that this is quite literally tearing the fabric of Ontario apart. You know, we have families that are at risk of eviction simply because they can't afford their rent. And if you think that the prices in Ontario are unrelated to the mess at the Landlord and Tenant Board, I would suggest that it's very much tied. Prices are a major reason for stress between landlords and tenants, and prices are very much psychological. The repeated stories in the press about bad tenants and abusive landlords and chaos at the Landlord and Tenant Board, this is causing havoc with prices, because landlords feel the need to price in extra buffers, extra security. They're always terrified of, you know, their rental investment being destroyed by the next bad tenant, when the reality is that this is just a couple of bad apples, a tiny fraction, but it just seems like such a much bigger problem. The last thing we need is a tribunal in chaos. And it just increases, it has a multiplying effect to the existing problems. So I put out the call on Facebook for suggestions from people who have been through the process about how can we fix the Landlord and Tenant Board. So some of a lot of the suggestions were related to education. A major gripe that a lot of people have that I hear is when you call the landlord and tenant board, you do not get help as a tenant. The people on the phone lines are not there to provide advice to renters in Ontario. They're clerks, they're there to facilitate the accessing of LTB processes. They're very good at what they do, but the major problem is all of the government websites, brochures, guides, they claim the landlord and tenant board is there to help you. So people call the board looking for help and there is none to be had. They're told to seek legal advice. And it just creates a spiral of reaching out, thrashing around, and wasting time when eviction is on the horizon. So that's the last thing we need. So the landlord and tenant board call center needs better press. They need to stop misleading people into calling them for the wrong reason. They need to triple the number of phone lines, because it is absolutely unacceptable in this day and age to call the landlord and tenant board. And not only are all of the operators occupied, but all of the on-hold lines are occupied. And there are no more phone lines left to even go on hold and see and hear a message saying that there's no more room for you, you'll have to call back. Instead, when everything is full, people call and just get disconnected with no explanation. It is incredibly frustrating, incredibly frustrating. So that's one of the easiest things that you could do to fix the landlord and tenant board, even just by fraction. The next thing people really suggested was pushing mediation more often. Mediation right now is part of the process, and but it's directly adjacent to the actual hearing at the landlord and tenant board. Basically at the last minute, you get a chance to mediate. Mediation could solve so many landlord and tenant board issues if it was just pushed at the front. So all these issues of looking for more adjudicators and trying to get more adjudicators appointed, a faster solution would be to appoint more mediators, hire people to help landlords and tenants sit down and resolve their issues, which from personal experience, I can tell you are 50, 60% misunderstanding of the process. They're not actual issues that are insurmountable. They just need somebody to explain to them, both landlord and tenant, that there exists a process. The Ontario system can work, but it's just overloaded to a ridiculous level. I've kind of run out of notes at this point, but I just hope that, you know, it's clear to everybody on this call that real people are being affected by this, and not enough of the general population understand that it's even an issue. And believe me when I say that I am absolutely terrified about the future. You know, it's so important to have secure housing, and the chaos at the landlord and tenant board is approaching the apocalypse level, and I'm very concerned. So I'll just end it there.
Okay, hello, I think it's my turn, and I'll just apologize that they appear to be three of me on the screen. That's a little technological glitch, but there's only one of me to speak this evening. So I'm just going to really, so I appreciate very much the concrete suggestions that each of you has offered. I just want to talk a little bit about the realities of what people are facing. And I think that this process has been politicized for some time at an earlier level, in that so many people are turned down from the outset. And I strongly suspect that workers are encouraged to turn people down. I've certainly seen this happening in the WSIB system, where people are really forced to appeal, forced then to ask for a hearing, in this case at the Social Benefits Tribunal. And that puts people in a state of desperation to survive. You have an illness, you have a disability, you need some means to live, and you are being told that you don't qualify. And so if you're lucky, then you'll get Ontario Works, and maybe if you have a large circle of friends, you will find a way to survive if you've got family around. But it creates utter despair in people. And frankly, I see people, even when they are on ODSP, really thinking about suicide. And that is not something that should be happening. So then, of course, if they have the wherewithal, they will apply to have a hearing. Social Benefits Tribunal, they've got a huge backlog. And I also want to thank, so I was able to have a long conversation with Claire Littleton yesterday, who was in charge of the Kinawea Legal Clinic in Thunder Bay, which is my home riding. And she was telling me that people are, so we know that new people are coming into the positions to be the adjudicators. But first of all, yes, we have seen that it is highly politicized who is getting those jobs. But even if it wasn't, to have lost all the experienced adjudicators means that the new adjudicators have no mentorship and aren't necessarily ready to do the job in a fair way. And so what you see also is that people who don't actually have a connection to the reality of people who are in need of accessing ODSP. Kathy, you talked about the fact that it's all done electronically now, pretty much. And I know when I was talking to Claire, she's saying that virtually nobody can get an in-person hearing. For the people in Thunder Bay, fortunately, the caseload numbers are such that Kinawea is able to provide legal support for people as they go through the system. But what she told me is that they are kind of making the system look a little bit better. They're catching up on this year's applicants, but are leaving behind the applicants from last year and the year before. So those people are waiting now year after year to even get a hearing. And then I have heard from individuals then who finally get the chance at a hearing, and they're dismissed within a few minutes after waiting a very long time. So that's crushing. Another piece of reality that is not there is the assumption that people have access to the internet, one, that they actually have a private place where they could use the internet, but if they don't have housing, they're not going to have access to a private space where they have internet, assuming that they could even afford to have the service. So you put people at an enormous disadvantage, and in many cases, in many other communities, as has already been indicated, people are having to represent themselves. Now, again, there is an assumption that everybody has the wherewithal to do that. Well, what happens if you have a brain injury? Do you have the wherewithal? What if you were born with FASD? Do you have the capacity to represent yourself in a highly stressful technical situation? Well, not necessarily. So it's already set up really for failure for so many people. And then as I also heard from Claire that because adjudicators aren't necessarily properly trained up to do the job, then they make bad decisions. And then there have to be further appeals of those bad decisions. So it creates more and more delays. I don't think I need to say a lot more than that. I appreciate that you have offered us some concrete solutions that we can take forward and offer as, I'm going to say non-denominational, non-partisan, approaches to solving the problem. I do think that there's also a political level for us to be arguing this, because it is so clearly part of a pattern of throwing people under the bus who are not available to generate profits. I'm going to put it that way. When people have disabilities, sometimes they would really like to be able to work. The supports generally aren't there. And when you have such a small amount of income in the first place, it's very hard to actually move forward and adapt to your disability and then move into a job position, assuming you can find a place that is accessible for your particular situation, and so on. So there's so much pitted against people. And that I see as part of an ideological position that is quite happy to say no and throw people under the bus. And then they have to cope with not only not having enough money to live on, I mean, they're not able to meet their basic needs, right? If we think of Maslow's hierarchy, you need a safe place to live. You need to be able to have food on the table. You need to be able to have a warm, dry, safe place. And those are just basics. And so many people don't have those and are put in the position of having to beg year after year after year. And we see the results of that. In Thunder Bay, use of the food banks, for example, has gone up enormously in the last couple of years. I could go on, but I think I will leave it there to say that there are practical elements and there are political elements to the work that needs to be done. But I really appreciate the practical elements that you've proposed, because we can certainly work with those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lise, and to Gilles and Gary and Kathy. You have kicked off this discussion with so much richness, and you've given us a lot to think about. I was watching the comments coming in from the chat, and I just want to flag a few things, because I think that it's important for us to contextualize what it is the problem. So we know that the crisis is here. But I just want to share some numbers, and I want to be able to do this so it can actually paint the picture on what are we struggling with. So the Landlord Tribunal Board, the Landlord and Tenant Board, excuse me, has a backlog of over 32,000 cases. In your case, Lise, when you're working with those at the Social Benefits Tribunal, there's 9,700 people at minimum ahead of you. If you're wanting to get in line now for an appeal, you gotta stand behind almost 10,000 people. And because hearings aren't necessarily being set up quickly, and by the time they are being set up, they're set up online, and then you are then faced with an adjudicator who's somehow not knowledgeable about the expertise, the field of law that they're supposed to adjudicate in. We're now facing this crisis. So everyone is stuck in line. If you're a tenant, you're stuck in line. If you are a landlord, you're stuck in line. If you are a person who's trying to pay for food, meaning that you have to get your ODSP approved, you are stuck in line. And this is before we even start looking into the Auto Accident Benefits License Appeal Tribunal, which has over 16,000 cases in backlog, and the Human Rights Tribunal, which has close to 9,000 additional cases. This is the problem we are facing. And I know my question, and this is why I want to sum it up this way, for Gary and Kathy in particular, Tribunal Watch Ontario, this is what you folks do. You try to find a solution to the crisis that's here. You've created a roadmap that talks about fixing the tribunal crisis. What are the 3 things that the provincial government must do in order for us to clear the backlog and to recognize the crisis for what it is, and then to make sure that the process can be depoliticized, meaning that you have the very best people who are qualified to adjudicate, and not necessarily because they're big PC donors?
Well, one thing I didn't mention so far is that we do need an immediate infusion of money in order to set up panels to deal exclusively with the backlog. This isn't rocket science. It's something that's been done before when tribunals have gotten into trouble, whether at the federal level or at any province. And so we need to bring in expert adjudicators to start working down that backlog. So that, and I was really interested to hear what Lise said about at the SBT, they're going forward with more recent cases and allowing older cases to stagnate. And that's partly because they know pressure is on them. So they're trying to figure out how to get helpful stats out. I didn't mention that the Human Rights Tribunal only had 16 decisions out last year. So you can be sure that they're right now working on trying to get better looking stats, but better looking stats won't mean the fundamental change that we need. So money is definitely part of it. Transparency is part of it. Why should we have to do an FOI request to find out what the backlog is at the Human Rights Tribunal? We don't know how many mediations are happening, how many settle. There's so little we know, and that is partly under the current leadership and the Ford government. It used to be that that data was published in the annual report. So we need transparency, we need money, and we need a fundamental change, as Gary has outlined, to the structure for recruiting adjudicators and identifying the skills needed. Actually, it's in the legislation. This government is just not following it.
Gary,
I don't have. I don't have much to add to Kathy's points. I think the short-term solutions are a challenge, and I'm more, I guess, interested in the long-term solutions. But those are long-term, so they're not going to help much in the next year or so. Unfortunately, we're that deep in.
And so would you say that there's no short-term solution? Like right now we're facing a crisis. Like if the government was to stand up tomorrow and acknowledge that there's a crisis, because right now they haven't even done that, is that one short-term step that they can take? Well,
that's certainly the first step. And I think I agree with Kathy's suggestions for short-term solutions. It is certainly with expert panels, backlog clearance panels with extra resources. Those will all help.
Can you if you can just unpack the expert panels? Is there a way to create almost like a SWAT team that's specialized, that goes in and says, okay, this is the backlog we're going to clear, and we're going to go and chip away at it? Like, is that part of the recommendation from Tribunal Watch? Because it's an elephant. We got to take it one bite at a time. How do we do that?
Yes, that is part of our recommendation, and it has been done in the past. And the government, it's taken the government so long to put in place the adjudicators that they now have there. It can be done more quickly, and it can be done in a truly competitive way. I mean, frankly, there are a lot of adjudicators, former adjudicators out there with experience that would come on part-time and work down that caseload. So it is very doable, but there is no will. And I'll just say that in the Tribunal Ontario's last annual report, the chair said, we are well on the way to being recognized as one of the best tribunals in North America. And the senior executive on staff said, we put access to justice at the center of everything we do. Well, that is not the experience of people in Ontario. So far from recognizing the problem, they are really creating I don't want to be rude, so I'll just say they're feeding us facts that are totally not true. Lise also mentioned something really important with respect to the SBT. The decisions that are made at the first level are overturned or withdrawn in the majority cases. So if you look at the ones that are withdrawn and the ones that are successful at appeal, about 80% of people eventually get SBT, even benefits, ODSP benefits, even though they've been turned down. So what kind of a system do we have that makes poor people jump through those hoops just to get which is really only a sustenance level of assistance? So, for years, legal clinics have been saying that, and the Auditor General has gotten it wrong a couple of times. So, a new government should really look at that issue, because frankly, the legal aid clinics also spend a disproportionate amount of time fighting these cases. Legal aid clinics could be helping people with employment law problems, discrimination, all kinds of other problems. I just want to say something else. The Attorney General bears a lot of responsibility for this. The labor tribunals don't have the backlogs. And they also didn't get rid of all their adjudicators. So it's our Attorney General that has allowed these tribunals to be robbed of their expertise and then taken his time to put in place new people who can't be blamed for not having experience. They're new. So, it's a multi-pronged problem, but it is solvable with political will, which we don't have.
Kathy, thank you. I know I see Lisa's hand up. I think you want to respond to something.
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, it sounds to me like they need to be hiring back people who have experience to fill those expert panels. There is a risk in pressing them to address the backlogs that they will address them by dismissing everybody. That is certainly a risk. But I also wanted to say something because I've seen in the Q&A, I don't know if it's premature to be addressing any of that, but a concern that landlords are being overlooked in this, that the challenges that landlords are facing. And I just want to say that I have received mail from small landlords who are really finding their lives are turned upside down as well because they can't get resolutions. They're waiting and waiting and waiting. So we know that is creating a very bad situation for everybody. And I think Gilles' suggestion about getting mediation in there much sooner is a good one. I just wanted to acknowledge that we do appreciate that it can create a hardship for people when we're talking about landlord-tenant board hearings, the lack of those hearings, that it creates a hardship for people on all sides of the conflict.
Thank you very much, Lise. I think that was really well said. The focus of tonight is really to take a look at how to fix the problem because everyone is stuck in the problem. So for those who are, I think we can all recognize that there are so many, it's not just the numbers. When I read the backlog numbers, they're not numbers, they're people. There are people who cannot pay their rent. There are people who cannot pay their mortgage. There's people who are struggling to just sort of stay afloat. And it's the people's lives that I'm most interested in because this is what we're supposed to do, especially as lawmakers. I want to ask a question to Gilles. I want to bring you into this conversation for just a minute. There's always going to be some concern from this government, any government really, about the cost of doing something. So therefore, there might be some incremental moves, but not big moves. If you could speak to Doug Ford, our premier, as well as the Attorney General, and you can say to them, what you want to say, what would that be? And specifically, if they tell you, well, it's very expensive, I'm not sure if we can afford it.
Well, I don't know what to say. I mean, looking for a single smoking gun that would slay the elephant, like you said, is not to be found. It's a complex problem. There's no way around it. It's going to cost money to hire more staff if the volume of cases at the Landlord and Tenant Board is too high. I think you need more adjudicators, better quality adjudicators, and more mediators. That's what it comes down to, because we need to push cases through the system. The backlogs are causing hardship and heartbreak for everybody that touches the system, both tenant and landlord.
Thank you very much. Kathy, I see your hand up, so go ahead, pipe in.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that, Gilles made a really good point earlier when he said that it hurts good tenants when landlords can't get a hearing to evict a tenant that isn't paying rent. There may not be very many of these tenants, but if a landlord can't get an application brought forward, then yes, they may subsequently raise the rent, and that hurts other tenants. It also has led to more self-help by landlords and tenants. Tenants not paying rent because the landlord hasn't done the repair, landlords trying to evict outside of the process. This is exactly why the landlord and tenant process was established, so that things will be done by the rule of law. And we do feel how desperate landlords are if they can't Because the way it used to work is you paid first and last month's rent. Well, you still do. And if a tenant didn't pay rent, then that 2 months, that extra month's rent you had gave you enough time to get the process underway. Now with 8 months, that's just ridiculous. It doesn't work at all. It's really shocking to me that the government has allowed this situation to continue as long as it has without taking drastic steps.
Yeah. Kathy, thank you. I do want to recognize the time crunch that we're under. I want to thank everyone for your participation. I certainly know that this is hopefully not the last webinar. It's going to be one of many. This is an issue that I know that each and every single one of you who's tuned in is very, very passionate about. Obviously, as members of the opposition, with our critic portfolios, we can get louder. We try to raise the alarm bell as much as we can to say, fix the problem. We need to make sure access to justice is available to everyone in a timely fashion, and that's why we're here. But you folks who are watching and also can do some things. I know it's really hard, and I know some of you have been. I recognize some names out there. You have been advocating and trying to get the government's attention. Well, don't give up. We've come together now. We want to continue to make some noise. I know that there are some journalists on this call as well, and I know that you're working on some stories. So we welcome you to let us know if there's any panelists that you want to speak to, because obviously they're subject matter experts. But also, tell people what's going on. And when we have to lay down, where does this information go? Who can actually fix the problem? It's really Doug Ford, our premier, as well as the Ministry of the Attorney General. And so these two gentlemen alone can actually do something to help alleviate the absolute crunch and crisis that we're in with the tribunals. And Gary, you're absolutely right. They would never be able to allow the politicization of the court system in the way that they have with the tribunal system. And I want to be able to hold on to that as much as possible, because one of the challenges that I see, and I think some of you may agree with me, is that we don't want to go in the way of America court systems. That would probably be one of the last things that I want to see in my beloved country and my beloved Ontario. And so being able to fix that problem as quickly as possible before it balloons and doubles again, because that's where we're heading if it doesn't get fixed. And it won't even matter how many webinars we do. It won't matter how many letters we write. By that time, the crisis is so deep, I don't know how we're going to get out of it. So right now, we just have to get a lot louder. So I want to thank our presenters tonight and everyone who tuned in. And for those who may be sharing this video afterwards, we're in this together. We're on your side. We want to fix the problem. And you have our commitment that this is why we've organized it and why we've come together. Ontario tribunals have not made viral media headlines. Other things have, perhaps Toronto politics, perhaps, Doug Ford's daughter's stag party. This doesn't always get to the media airwaves in the same type of way. So I know that the issue is technical. I know we're fighting for a lot of competing interests, but this issue matters for the reasons that have been spoken about today. Ontario tribunals underpin the rule of law for each and every single one of us, and we all want to benefit from that. Access to justice are expectations at minimum of every Ontarian, and I want to make sure that we can deliver that as much as possible, and I believe that we can if, and Kathy named it, if the political will is there. And right now, it is not. I want to end off by sharing that my stepfather is Ukrainian. And I can't think about, him and our extended family around the dinner table without thinking about the demolition and the destruction of the democratic institutions in the Ukraine and other war zones. So much of this that we are seeing, although there are not bombs that are coming down on us, we are still seeing our judicial and justice system, tribunal system slowly eroding and dismantling. And this is worth fighting for. So I want to say thank you to all of you, and I want you to just keep in touch with us. Feel free to write into us if you like. If there's something that you want us to cover in the future, we'd be happy to, but let's keep the dialogue going. And thank you to our esteemed panelists, each and every single one of you. Your contributions were incredible, really rich in our dialogue tonight. Thank you.